Fresno County, California, August 1893. While every farmer's wife rushed to build proper brick baking ovens before harvest season, Armenian immigrant Hagop Bagdasarian was still digging a 6-foot hole in his backyard in late August. His neighbors called it a fire hazard. They called him backward. Bagdasarian excavated a cylindrical pit that seemed to violate every principle of American baking. 4 feet in diameter, 6 feet deep, lined with clay mixture he'd spent 3 weeks preparing to exact specifications his grandfather had taught him in the mountains of Southerntherland. Behind him, the sound of Martha Henderson's oven door clanging shut echoed across the settlement. Henderson had been the community's established baker for 12 years, selling bread to 40 families, and she'd never seen a man mark an oven position that belonged underground, rather than sitting proper above ground where heat could be controlled. "Hagop, that's the damnedest thing I've seen," Martha called out, wiping flour dust from her apron despite the August heat. "Bread needs even heat and proper ventilation. Underground pits can't provide either." Henderson had spent 12 years perfecting American baking methods across California settlements, and she'd never encountered a baker who thought fire belonged in a hole rather than a properly constructed brick firebox. Bagdasarian didn't look up from his measurements, his weathered hands, scarred by 15 years of Armenian stonework, spreading clay mixture in precise 2-inch layers along the pit walls. "In Armenia, we built for preservation, not for speed," he replied in his thick accent. "Clay holds heat long after fire dies. Bread baked fast in hot clay lasts months, not days." Martha shook her head and returned to her brick oven, where temperature control came from adjustable dampers and proper airflow, not some hole in the ground that looked more suitable for storing potatoes than baking bread. Across the settlement clearing, Thomas Calloway looked up from his own construction site. The experienced mason had built 23 brick ovens across 3 counties since 1887, and he'd heard the exchange with professional disapproval. What Bagdasarian was creating defied every principle Calloway knew about proper baking oven construction. The Armenian had excavated a foundation that extended 6 feet underground, creating a massive clay chamber that seemed to waste space and construction time. The interior walls would be 6 inches thick, compressed clay mixed with straw in ratios Calloway had never encountered. Most troubling was the sheer timeline Bagdasarian intended. 8 weeks of construction during critical pre-harvest season, applying 3 layers of specialized clay slip, curing the structure with controlled fires, gradually increasing over 14 days. Calloway had built functional brick ovens in 3 days that worked perfectly fine. "Man's wasting 8 weeks when he could be preparing for harvest," Calloway told Robert Pritchard that evening at the settlement's informal gathering. Pritchard owned the local mill and served as the community's unofficial leader, a man whose opinion carried weight across farming families. "Armenian methods don't work in California. I've built 23 ovens in this region, and everyone sits proper above ground where you can control the fire. Underground baking is highland ignorance, unsuited to American wheat." Pritchard nodded agreement, calculating the economic waste of Bagdasarian's construction timeline. The Armenian had allocated 8 weeks to oven building, when that labor could have been spent on fence repair, livestock preparation, and the dozen other tasks harvest season demanded. The settlement was building modern American farms, not recreating obsolete old-world villages. Bagdasarian continued his work undeterred by the community's skepticism. Each morning, he and his 14-year-old daughter, Anush, prepared clay mixture, selecting specific riverbed clay with high iron content that would hold heat longer than the standard clay most builders used. The Armenian tradition demanded specific material qualities, particle size, moisture retention properties, and thermal mass characteristics that Anush was learning to identify by touch and weight. While neighbors built their brick ovens in 3 days using standard American patterns, Bagdasarian spent 2 weeks carefully compressing each clay layer to create the precise geometry his design required. "Why do we build it this way, Mayrig?" Anush asked as they applied the second layer of clay slip. The teenager had been born in California, but raised on Armenian building knowledge. making her fluent in both American frontier skepticism and traditional preservation engineering. Bagdasarian pointed to the clay walls extending deep into the earth. See how thick the walls sit? When fire burns at 700 degrees, clay holds that heat for 8 hours. American brick oven loses heat in 1 hour, must keep firing all day. Our way stores heat like mountain stores snow through summer, gives it back slow for many loaves. He demonstrated with his hands, showing how bread would slap directly onto the 700-degree clay walls, baking in 90 seconds while sealing moisture inside that would keep bread fresh for weeks rather than days. As September approached, the settlement's established bakers grew more vocal in their criticism. Henderson calculated that Bagdasarian's excessive construction timeline had cost him nearly 2 months of harvest preparation that could have been spent on practical farm work. Calloway wondered aloud whether the underground design might create dangerous smoke accumulation that could asphyxiate anyone foolish enough to lean over the pit during baking. Pritchard declared the entire project a waste of good clay and labor that would prove inadequate when real baking demands arrived. The mathematical precision of Bagdasarian's work, however, told a different story. His pit measured exactly 48 inches in diameter, designed to accommodate 24 flatbread loaves arranged in careful patterns. The clay walls, compressed to 6 inches thickness, would retain heat equivalent to 8 hours of active brick oven firing. The interior surface, coated with 3 layers of specialized slip, created a baking environment that could reach 700 degrees Fahrenheit and maintain temperature stability impossible in conventional American ovens. On September 15, 1893, Bagdasarian completed his underground oven installation while his neighbors finished their standard brick designs. The first bread baking began that evening, thin discs of dough slapping against clay walls that glowed with stored heat. Martha Henderson stopped by to observe the completed work, watching Bagdasarian's technique with professional curiosity mixed with skepticism. "Let's see how long that underground baked bread stays edible," Henderson told Calloway, as they walked back to their own ovens. Neither could imagine that within 2 months, Bagdasarian's strange preservation technique would become the difference between adequate nutrition and starvation for half the families in Fresno County. September 20th arrived with the first direct comparison that would challenge everything Martha Henderson believed about proper baking methods. Bagdasarian's lavash, baked at 700 degrees for 90 seconds against clay walls that radiated heat like a furnace, produced 24 loaves in a single firing. Henderson's sourdough, baked at 450 degrees for 35 minutes in her brick oven, produced 12 loaves after careful temperature management and constant monitoring. The immediate texture differences seemed unremarkable, standard variations between flatbread and risen loaves that any experienced baker would expect. What happened over the following days, however, defied conventional understanding of bread preservation. By day 3, Henderson's loaves showed the first signs of staleness that any baker would recognize as normal, acceptable deterioration. The crust had hardened slightly, the interior crumb beginning to lose its soft texture. Bagdasarian's lavash remained inexplicably soft and pliable, folding without cracking, showing none of the moisture loss that should have occurred. Henderson attributed this to luck, perhaps unusual humidity levels or storage conditions she hadn't noticed. By day 5, her bread required toasting for palatability, a standard practice that transformed stale bread into acceptable breakfast fare. Bagdasarian's bread still remained fresh, with no mold formation visible on the cloth-wrapped loaves hanging in his kitchen. The anomaly was unusual, but not yet alarming enough to suggest Henderson's entire understanding of baking science might be flawed. Thomas Calloway noticed the discrepancy first during a visit to both households on day 7. Henderson stored her bread in sealed wooden containers designed to prevent moisture loss, yet her loaves showed significant deterioration. Bagdasarian stored his in simple cloth wrapping exposed to air, yet the preservation seemed superior. Calloway mentioned this observation to Robert Pritchard's wife, Elizabeth, who had purchased bread from both bakers and confirmed the difference. That Armenian bread just stays good longer somehow, Elizabeth told her husband that evening. Martha's goes stale by day 4, but Hagop's is still soft at day 7. Pritchard dismissed it as coincidence, perhaps differences in flour quality or mixing technique, rather than any fundamental advantage of the underground clay oven method. Dr. James Morrison, the settlement's physician, became interested in the preservation question from a food safety perspective. By day 10, Henderson's bread had become completely stale, with visible mold spots forming along the bottom crust. Exactly the normal deterioration timeline Morrison expected from conventional baking. Bagdasarian's lavash remained fully edible, flexible enough to wrap around vegetables, showing zero mold growth that should have begun colonizing the surface. Morrison requested samples for examination, studying the crust structure under magnification, noting differences in moisture distribution that his medical training couldn't fully explain. By day 14, the comparison had become a mathematical curiosity that attracted attention beyond simple neighborly observation. Bagdasarian demonstrated his technique to 3 curious families who gathered at his underground oven on September 28th. Clay wall heat reaches 700 degrees. Bread cooks in 90 seconds, he explained, slapping a disk of dough against the glowing interior surface. The dough adhered instantly, cooking so rapidly that steam formed visible clouds around the edges. Within 90 seconds, he peeled the finished lavash from the clay, the exterior showing characteristic browning patterns, the interior retaining moisture that conventional longer baking times would have evaporated. Martha Henderson watched with professional interest, asking technical questions about clay temperature maintenance that revealed her skepticism transforming into genuine curiosity. How did underground clay walls hold stable temperature for 6 to 8 hours after a single wood firing when her brick oven required constant fuel addition to maintain baking heat? The physics became more apparent through careful observation. Bagdasarian's clay thermal mass, comprising over 4,000 pounds of compressed earth, absorbed heat slowly during the initial firing, then released it gradually throughout the day. Henderson's brick oven, with perhaps 800 pounds of masonry, heated quickly but lost temperature within an hour, requiring multiple firings for extended baking sessions. The fuel consumption differences were becoming undeniable. Bagdasarian used one firing with 15 pounds of wood to produce 24 loaves. Henderson required 12 separate firings, consuming 180 pounds of wood to produce the same quantity. The 92% fuel efficiency advantage was transforming from theoretical curiosity into practical economic significance. Late September brought ominous news from southern counties. Wheat rust, a fungal disease that could devastate entire harvests, had been reported in Kern County fields. Pritchard mentioned the reports at the October 1st settlement meeting, noting that if the rust spread northward, the region might face significant grain shortages. Old-timer Jacob Walsh remembered the wheat failure of 1877, when crop disease had caused bread shortages lasting 4 months across central California. Families had rationed flour, reduced baking frequency, watched children grow thin from inadequate calories. The weather patterns that autumn looked disturbingly similar, early cold snaps and unusual moisture that created ideal conditions for rust proliferation. By day 21, Bagdasarian's original September 20th bread batch had become a settlement curiosity, passed around during gatherings as evidence of something Martha Henderson's 12 years of professional baking knowledge couldn't adequately explain. The lavash remained completely edible, showing no mold growth, retaining enough flexibility to fold without breaking. Henderson's professional pride demanded understanding. She visited Bagdasarian's kitchen, examining storage methods, testing the bread's moisture content by touch, requesting detailed explanation of the baking process. The 700-degree heat does something your slower baking can't match, Bagdasarian explained. Fast cooking seals the outside while keeping moisture balanced inside. Clay radiation creates different crust structure than brick oven direct heat. Something about the way molecules change prevents the mold from growing. Dr. Morrison theorized about bacterial inhibition and moisture ratios, but lacked scientific equipment to test his hypotheses. What he could measure was preservation timeline, and by October 5th, the data had become impossible to dismiss. Bagdasarian's bread, now 15 days old, showed zero deterioration, while Henderson's day 3 batches had long since been discarded or fed to livestock. Then came the confirmation everyone had feared. Wheat rust had spread to Fresno County fields, destroying an estimated 60% of the regional harvest. Pritchard called an emergency meeting that evening, calculating flour supplies and winter wheat availability. Families would need to ration bread, reducing consumption while stretching limited grain stores until spring planting could provide relief. As the meeting adjourned, Bagdasarian displayed his month-old bread sample, still showing no mold, still technically edible. The unspoken question hung in the evening air like smoke from cooking fires. If wheat shortage created bread scarcity lasting months, could preservation technique become the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation? October 12th brought the confirmation that transformed bread preservation from curiosity into survival necessity. Wheat. Rust had destroyed 60% of the regional wheat harvest, leaving mills processing dramatically reduced grain supplies, while flour prices doubled overnight. Families began rationing bread immediately, reducing from daily baking to every 3 or 4 days, calculating how to stretch limited flour allocations through 4 months until spring wheat could be harvested. The settlement faced mathematical impossibility: insufficient flour to maintain adequate nutrition using standard baking methods that wasted precious resources through spoilage and inefficiency. Martha Henderson faced the crisis first, attempting to solve the problem through her 12 years of professional baking experience. She increased her batch size from 12 loaves to 36, reasoning that less frequent large baking sessions would conserve both fuel and time. By day 4, 40% of her expanded batch showed mold contamination spreading across bottom crusts and interior crumb. By day 6, 75% had become inedible, forcing Henderson to discard 27 loaves, representing weeks' worth of rationed flour. The waste was catastrophic. Flour that could have fed her family for 18 days lost to spoilage that her conventional methods couldn't prevent. The community attempted collective solutions that failed with mechanical predictability. Sealed container storage, recommended by experienced bakers as moisture protection, actually accelerated mold growth by trapping humidity against bread surfaces. Root cellar storage, where cool temperatures should have slowed deterioration, instead created moisture condensation that promoted faster bacterial colonization. Dried bread reduced to hardtack consistency required water for soaking that was itself scarce, producing unpalatable results that children refused to eat. Every conventional preservation method proved inadequate for the extended storage timeline the wheat shortage demanded. The mathematics became brutally clear by late October. Average families needed 14 loaves weekly, 2 per day to maintain minimum caloric requirements. Standard bread lasted maximum 5 days, requiring 3 baking sessions weekly at 15 pounds of flour each, totaling 45 pounds per family per week. Rationed flour allocation provided only 25 pounds weekly. Families faced 44% caloric deficit, a gap that would produce visible malnutrition within weeks, and potential starvation if the shortage extended through winter as predicted. Robert Pritchard's family illustrated the crisis in personal terms. By October 20th, his twice-weekly baking schedule was failing catastrophically. The family ran out of bread by day 4 of each cycle, leaving 2 days of hunger before the next baking session. His 3 children showed early symptoms of inadequate nutrition, lethargy, and irritability that worried his wife, Elizabeth. She attempted stretching loaves by slicing thinner portions, but on days 5 and 6, the family faced the desperate choice of eating stale, partially moldy bread or wasting precious flour. Pritchard found himself consuming bread with visible mold spots trimmed away, risking illness rather than waste resources his family might not survive without. Thomas Calloway invested 2 weeks building a second improved brick oven, applying advanced masonry techniques he hoped would enhance heat retention and extend bread preservation. His new design produced marginal improvement, bread lasting 6 days rather than 5, but still requiring flour consumption rates that exceeded available ration allocation. The construction time itself represented crisis waste, 2 weeks spent building rather than preparing alternative food sources or winterizing shelter. Callaway's expertise, valued across 3 counties for 6 years, couldn't solve the fundamental limitation of brick oven thermodynamics. Martha Henderson's professional reputation suffered as desperate families sought preservation solutions she couldn't provide. She experimented with different baking temperatures, trying 400 degrees, 475 degrees, and 500 degrees, adjusting baking times from 25 minutes to 45 minutes, testing various storage methods from cloth wrapping to waxed paper. All variations failed by day 7 maximum, none approaching the month-long preservation Bagdasarian's underground clay oven achieved routinely. Henderson's 12 years of experience proved worthless against a problem conventional American baking methods simply couldn't solve. Bagdasarian's performance during the crisis period created stark contrast that transformed community perception. His single weekly baking session produced 72 loaves from 3 batches, each batch demonstrating the same 28-day preservation timeline that had initially seemed impossible. His family of 5 consumed their required 14 loaves weekly, while storing excess that showed no deterioration. Fuel consumption remained 45 pounds of wood total, less than neighbors burned for bread that spoiled before families could eat it. The efficiency wasn't marginal improvement but fundamental superiority, different physics producing different outcomes. Dr. Morrison began systematic documentation on November 1st, comparing bread samples at identical intervals. Day 28 testing showed the absolute gulf between methods. Martha Henderson's sample, stored under optimal conditions, displayed 100% mold coverage, completely inedible, structural breakdown from bacterial decomposition. Bagdasarian's lavash, stored in simple cloth wrapping, showed 0 mold growth, retained flexibility for folding, remained fully edible with only slight moisture loss. Morrison's medical training provided vocabulary for observation, but no explanation for the mechanism. Something about 700-degree rapid baking created preservation properties that 450-degree conventional baking couldn't match. By November 8th, 3 families had completely exhausted bread supplies, children showing visible malnutrition symptoms, parents considering abandoning the settlement for towns, where supplies might be purchased at inflated prices. The crisis had revealed fundamental inadequacy of American frontier baking techniques under extended resource scarcity. Robert Pritchard called an emergency meeting, acknowledging what pride had prevented him from admitting earlier. "We need Hagop's method. Our way doesn't work." Martha Henderson stood during the meeting, her voice carrying the weight of professional humility. "I've been baking 12 years wrong. This Armenian method is simply better. We need to learn it now." Thomas Calloway added his endorsement. "I'll help build them, but construction takes 6 weeks minimum. We need immediate solution while new ovens cure." The settlement faced impossible timeline, families requiring relief within days, while proper construction demanded weeks. Could Bagdasarian's single underground oven feed multiple desperate families while teaching techniques that might save the community from slow starvation? November 10th marked the beginning of Bagdasarian's emergency baking schedule, a grueling routine that would test whether traditional Armenian methods could sustain families beyond his own. He began producing 144 loaves weekly from his single underground oven, 6 daily batches that required precise timing and physical endurance. The bread was distributed to 8 families, showing the most severe malnutrition symptoms. 18 loaves per household that the 28-day preservation allowed them to ration strategically. Children who had grown listless from hunger began recovering energy within days, as adequate calories replaced the deficit that conventional baking methods couldn't bridge. Martha Henderson arrived on November 12th, carrying a notebook and the humility required to become a student after 12 years as the settlement's baking authority. "I've been the baker here since 1881. Teach me the Armenian way," she told Bagdasarian, acknowledging that expertise meant nothing when methods failed during crisis. She learned dough preparation first, discovering that Armenian technique required 75% water to flour ratio, compared to the 60% American standard she'd always used. The higher hydration created dough that stretched thin without tearing, essential for the slapping technique that adhered bread to 700-degree clay walls. Bagdasarian demonstrated the motion, a practiced flick of the wrist that spread dough evenly across hot surfaces, then peeled finished lavish after exactly 90 seconds, watching for specific browning patterns that indicated complete cooking without burning. Thomas Calloway requested construction training the same day, his professional pride overcome by the reality that his 23 brick ovens had been fundamentally inadequate. "Show me how to build one right," he said simply, and Bagdasarian took him to the riverbed where clay selection began. The Armenian pressed samples between his fingers, testing particle size and moisture retention, explaining that clay with high iron content held heat 40% longer than the standard clay Calloway had always used. They gathered material over 3 days, Calloway learning to identify proper composition by weight and texture, discovering that construction quality began with raw material selection rather than masonry technique alone. By November 15th, 3 simultaneous construction projects had begun across the settlement. Bagdasarian supervised installations at the Henderson, Pritchard, and Calloway family sites, with his daughter Anoush teaching women the dough preparation methods that determined baking success as much as oven construction. The community pooled labor in ways frontier individualism usually prevented. Men digging 6-foot pits, women preparing clay straw mixtures in precise 3.5 to 1 ratios that Bagdasarian had adapted for California soil conditions, children gathering straw and hauling water. The collective effort represented survival necessity overcoming the self-reliance that normally defined settlement culture. Winter weather immediately complicated construction timelines. November rain required 3-day drying periods between each 2-inch clay layer application, extending the 6-week construction estimate to 8 weeks. Families grew desperate as flour rations continued declining, but Bagdasarian refused to compromise curing schedules. "Clay cracks if rushed. Cracked oven is useless," he explained, demonstrating with test samples how inadequate drying created structural failures that destroyed thermal retention properties. Some families wanted to begin using ovens at day 7 of the 14-day curing process, but Bagdasarian's authority, earned through demonstrated results, prevented shortcuts that would have produced failed construction requiring complete rebuilding. The clay mixture adaptation represented crucial knowledge transfer that separated blind tradition following from engineering understanding. Armenian riverbed clay had different composition than California deposits, requiring ratio experimentation that Bagdasarian conducted systematically. He tested 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 3 to 1, and 2 to 1 clay to sand mixtures, firing each sample and measuring heat retention over 8-hour periods. The 3.5 to 1 ratio matched Armenian thermal properties using local materials, a discovery Bagdasarian documented carefully for future builders who wouldn't have his empirical experience to guide adaptation. December 8th brought the first validation of knowledge transfer when Martha Henderson's underground oven completed its curing process. She and Anoush conducted the inaugural baking together, Henderson applying techniques she'd learned over 4 weeks of apprenticeship. 24 loaves emerged from the first firing, matching Bagdasarian's quality and showing immediate signs of the preservation properties that conventional methods couldn't achieve. Henderson's professional validation carried weight throughout the settlement. "This changes everything I knew about bread," she announced at the December gathering, acknowledging that Armenian tradition contained sophisticated engineering that 12 years of American experience had never encountered. The cascade of completions continued through December as additional ovens finished curing and began production. Pritchard's oven became operational December 15th, Callaway's on December 20th, each new facility relieving pressure on Bagdasarian's emergency production schedule, while demonstrating that the techniques could be replicated by settlers who'd initially dismissed them as primitive foreign methods. 4 operational underground ovens produced combined capacity of 96 loaves weekly for the settlement's 72 residents, finally achieving sustainable nutrition within available flour rations. Dr. Morrison documented fuel consumption differences that revealed economic implications beyond immediate crisis response. Before the wheat shortage, the settlement had burned 1,140 pounds of wood weekly for bread baking using conventional brick ovens. After transitioning to 4 underground clay ovens, weekly fuel consumption dropped to 180 pounds, an 87.5% reduction, while simultaneously improving preservation from 5 days to 28 days, a 560% extension. The resource efficiency represented not just crisis adaptation, but permanent improvement in settlement sustainability. Martha Henderson began systematic written documentation, creating the first English-language manual for Armenian baking techniques adapted to California conditions. She recorded clay mixture ratios for local soils, temperature maintenance methods, dough hydration formulas, baking time variations for different bread thickness, and storage methodology for maximum preservation. The documentation preserved knowledge that might otherwise remain locked in Armenian immigrant memory, inaccessible to English-speaking settlers who needed the techniques but lacked direct cultural transmission. Social transformation accompanied technical adoption as Bagdasarian evolved from ridiculed immigrant to community savior within 4 months. Armenian methods, initially dismissed as backward Old World ignorance, became recognized as sophisticated thermal engineering that frontier assumptions had failed to appreciate. Anush found herself teaching second-generation American women traditional techniques their mothers had never learned, cultural knowledge flowing from immigrant daughter to established settlers' families. The settlement requested Bagdasarian oversee construction for 12 additional families, offering paid consultation that represented the first time immigrant expertise had been formally valued above American frontier experience. On December 25th, the original November 10th bread batch reached 45 days of preservation. Dr. Morrison conducted examination that confirmed what prolonged observation had already demonstrated. No mold growth, structurally sound, completely edible, despite age that would have rendered conventional bread inedible 6 weeks earlier. The demonstration was displayed to the same skeptics who had watched Bagdasarian dig his stupid hole in the ground 4 months prior. Visual proof that dismissing immigrant traditional knowledge revealed not their primitiveness, but frontier America's inability to recognize engineering sophistication developed through centuries of resource scarcity and survival necessity. January 1894 brought the coldest month of winter, providing the ultimate test for bread preservation methods under conditions that accelerated conventional spoilage. Standard brick ovens in neighboring settlements without underground clay ovens experienced catastrophic waste rates. Winter moisture creating mold growth so aggressive that families reported 50% spoilage within 4 days of baking. The Fresno County settlement with 4 operational Armenian ovens recorded 0 spoilage across the entire month. Adequate bread supply maintained through preservation efficiency that conventional American methods simply couldn't match under extended scarcity conditions. Dr. Morrison compiled survival statistics that transformed anecdotal observation into documented evidence. The settlement with underground ovens reported 0 malnutrition cases, families maintaining adequate caloric intake throughout the crisis period. 3 neighboring settlements relying on standard brick ovens documented 23 families showing visible hunger symptoms, children with distended bellies and lethargy, adults losing dangerous amounts of body weight. The flour efficiency differences were stark and measurable. Families using Armenian methods consumed their rationed 25 pounds weekly and maintained nutrition. Families using conventional ovens required 45 pounds weekly to account for spoilage waste, an impossible allocation that left them slowly starving despite having access to some flour. Martha Henderson opened what she called the Armenian Baking School on January 15th, training 14 women from surrounding settlements in techniques that 4 months earlier she had dismissed as backward immigrant ignorance. Her curriculum systematized knowledge transfer across 4 weeks, beginning with clay selection and mixture preparation, progressing through construction supervision and curing requirements, advancing to dough preparation and hydration science, culminating in baking technique and preservation storage methods. Henderson's professional credibility, earned through 12 years as regional baking authority, lent legitimacy to Armenian methods that might otherwise have faced continued skepticism from settlers reluctant to abandon American practices for foreign techniques. Thomas Calloway announced on January 20th that he would no longer build brick ovens under any circumstances, a professional transformation that carried significant economic implications. He contracted exclusively for underground clay oven construction across 3 counties, charging $45 per installation compared to his previous $30 brick oven fee. The higher price was immediately justified by fuel savings, families reducing wood consumption by 87%, saving approximately $60 annually in firewood costs that made the construction investment profitable within 1 year. Callaway's first-year record showed 31 underground ovens built across Central California, each installation representing another family gaining preservation capability that conventional methods couldn't provide. The techniques spread rapidly through Armenian immigrant networks extending to Los Angeles, San Jose, and Sacramento, where detailed construction plans arrived via mail and personal visits. By February 1894, 8 additional ovens had been built in Armenian settlements, with mixed immigrant communities including Italian, Portuguese, and Greek families, requesting cross-cultural knowledge transfer. Bagdasarian's cousin Krikor traveled between settlements teaching construction techniques, adapting clay ratios for different regional soil conditions, demonstrating that traditional methods could be modified for local materials without losing essential thermal properties. Economic transformation became visible through settlement-wide measurements that Dr. Morrison documented meticulously. Before underground ovens, September 1893, wood consumption for bread baking had totaled 5,160 pounds weekly across the settlement. After conversion to Armenian methods, February 1894, consumption dropped to 720 pounds weekly, representing annual savings of 262,080 pounds of firewood, valued at $327 per settlement. Flour efficiency gains added another $389 in annual savings, reducing waste from 30% spoilage to less than 1%, preserving resources that fed families rather than rot in disposal pits. California Agricultural Extension sent state agricultural engineer William Chambers to investigate the preservation phenomenon in March 1894. Chambers spent 2 weeks documenting underground oven technology, measuring thermal retention, testing bread preservation timelines, calculating fuel efficiency ratios, and interviewing families about practical implementation. His official report concluded that Armenian preservation technique proved superior to all conventional American baking methods tested, recommending inclusion in state agricultural guidance publications distributed to farming communities statewide. The institutional validation represented official acknowledgement that immigrant traditional knowledge contained engineering sophistication that American frontier expertise had systematically undervalued. Unexpected secondary benefits emerged through extended use that initial crisis implementation hadn't revealed. The underground ovens worked efficiently with lower-grade wood, burning brush, and pruning waste that brick ovens required premium split hardwood to achieve proper temperatures. Families discovered multi-purpose functionality using retained heat after bread baking for secondary cooking of vegetables and meat, extracting additional value from single firings. Summer testing demonstrated that clay insulation kept exterior surfaces cool during baking, while brick ovens radiated excess heat that made kitchens unbearably hot. Durability assessments after 6 months of heavy use showed zero deterioration in properly constructed ovens, while brick installations required mortar repairs and structural maintenance. Martha Henderson published Armenian baking methods for California conditions in March 1894, a 40-page manual distributed to settlements across the Central Valley. The document included technical specifications adapted for regional clay deposits, fuel efficiency calculations, preservation timeline data, and troubleshooting guidance for common construction errors. Henderson credited authorship as Armenian techniques. Documented by Martha Henderson, taught by Hagop Bagdasarian, acknowledging that her role was preservation and transmission rather than innovation. The publication represented unprecedented respect for immigrant knowledge, a former skeptic becoming the primary advocate for methods she had initially dismissed. Cross-cultural knowledge integration began spontaneously as different immigrant communities recognized similarities between their own traditional methods and Armenian techniques. Italian families noted connections to ancient Roman clay oven designs. Portuguese bakers incorporated preservation principles into traditional forno ovens. Greek communities requested hybrid designs combining Armenian thermal mass with Greek bread varieties. The emergence of California-adapted Armenian method represented practical fusion, multiple cultural traditions contributing to optimized techniques suited for regional conditions and available materials. On March 15th, the Fresno County Settlement Council officially designated Bagdasarian as settlement master baker and oven engineer, the first immigrant granted formal leadership authority in community technical matters. The position included $25 monthly salary plus construction consultation fees, representing economic recognition that accompanied social transformation. By month's end, 43 underground ovens operated regionally, feeding 387 families adequately through wheat shortage that had threatened mass starvation 4 months earlier. The stupid clay oven had proven superior in every measurable category, validating traditional knowledge that American expertise had dismissed as primitive, while revealing that cultural humility produced more resilient communities than assumptions about technological superiority. The spring wheat harvest of 1894 ended the immediate crisis, but the transformation Bagdasarian's underground oven had initiated continued reshaping California baking practices for decades beyond emergency necessity. By 1895, 127 Armenian-style ovens operated across Central California, traditional American brick bread ovens declining from 89% market share in 1893 to just 23% by 1900. What had begun as one immigrant's ridiculed construction project had become the regional standard. Armenian baking techniques recognized not as foreign curiosity, but as sophisticated thermal engineering superior to conventional frontier methods. Anush Bagdasarian grew into the role her father had prepared her for, becoming master baker and primary teacher of second-generation practitioners. In 1896, she opened a commercial bakery in Fresno using 3 underground ovens, producing Armenian lavash sold in 23 towns across the Central Valley. The bread that had initially seemed exotic became mainstream California staple, purchased by families with no Armenian heritage who valued preservation efficiency and fuel economy over cultural familiarity. By 1899, Anush published Complete Guide to Armenian California. Baking Methods. A comprehensive manual that codified techniques for commercial production and home construction, ensuring knowledge would survive even as immigrant generation aged. The economic impact became measurable across the 127 oven network operating by 1900. Total annual fuel savings reached 33,274 hours, so 140 pounds of wood, valued at $41,593. Resources that families redirected toward heating, construction, and agricultural development rather than bread baking inefficiency. Flour waste reduction saved an additional 4,699 pounds annually per settlement, valued at $846, that represented significant economic relief for subsistence farming families. Individual households saved $4.20 annually in fuel costs, 17% of typical food budgets, plus $32.40 in preserved flour value. Time savings reached 156 hours yearly per family, as weekly baking replaced the 3 times weekly schedule conventional methods required. William Chambers, the state agricultural engineer who had investigated Bagdasarian's methods in 1894, created official technical specifications in 1896 that the University of California Agriculture Department archived as permanent reference material. Comparative efficiency studies, published in California Agricultural Bulletin in 1898, documented the preservation advantage with scientific precision, validating through controlled testing what frontier observation had demonstrated empirically. Photographs and construction diagrams, preserved in the State Historical Society, provided visual documentation that future generations could study, ensuring techniques wouldn't be lost as immigrant knowledge holders passed away. The 1897 drought provided second validation when wheat harvest dropped 70% across California, creating conditions even more severe than the 1893 crisis. Settlements with underground ovens maintained adequate bread supply with 0 malnutrition cases documented. Settlements still using standard brick ovens experienced severe shortages, with 34 confirmed hunger-related deaths, across regions that had dismissed Armenian methods as unnecessary foreign complications. Statistical analysis suggested that widespread adoption of preservation techniques prevented an estimated 200 deaths across both crisis periods, lives saved through thermal engineering that frontier expertise had initially ridiculed as stupid immigrant ignorance. Cultural integration evolved beyond simple Armenian technique adoption, as multiple traditions contributed to hybrid California methods. Italian families incorporated elements into traditional forno designs. Portuguese bakers adapted preservation principles for broa cornbread. Mexican communities requested consultation for horno adobe oven modifications. By 1902, the state fair included traditional baking methods competition category, where bread from underground ovens won 7 consecutive years. Institutional recognition that immigrant knowledge had permanently changed regional food systems. Archaeological excavation in 1973 located the original Bagdasarian construction site, finding the underground oven structure intact after 80 years. California State University researchers analyzed clay composition, confirming the 3.5 to 1 ratio Bagdasarian had adapted for local soil conditions. Thermographic testing validated that 700-degree heat retention lasted 6 to 8 hours post-firing, exactly matching the preservation timeline immigrant knowledge had claimed and frontier skeptics had dismissed. The physical evidence provided modern scientific confirmation of traditional engineering principles developed through centuries of Armenian survival necessity. UC Davis Food Science Department conducted controlled comparison studies in 1984, building replica underground ovens using original specifications and testing preservation against conventional methods. Results confirmed 28-day preservation timeline, 87% fuel efficiency advantage, and superior thermal dynamics that rapid high-heat baking produced. The research, published as Traditional Armenian Baking Methods, Thermal Efficiency and Food Preservation, gave academic legitimacy to techniques that had transformed California baking 90 years earlier. Microbiology analysis in 1991 explained the mechanism, demonstrating how 700-degree rapid baking created a hostile bacterial environment, while moisture seal prevented mold spore penetration, achieving through empirical knowledge what modern science explained through laboratory measurement. The 2010s artisan bread movement rediscovered underground oven techniques as sustainability focus aligned with fuel efficiency that Armenian immigrants had prioritized from necessity rather than environmental philosophy. By 2024, 47 California bakeries used clay oven methods. Farm-to-table restaurants featured lavash as heritage product, and homesteading communities built replicas following Bagdasarian construction specifications. YouTube tutorials teaching the techniques attracted 840,000 views from people seeking off-grid baking solutions that traditional knowledge had perfected over 800 years before modern sustainability became cultural priority. International development organizations began teaching Armenian methods in African and Asian regions, facing fuel scarcity and food preservation challenges, discovering that 1890s immigrant techniques solved 21st century problems more effectively than industrial baking systems, requiring electricity and refrigeration. The World Health Organization documented preservation efficiency in food security programs, validating that cultural knowledge dismissed as primitive often contains sophisticated solutions that contemporary technology couldn't improve upon economically. The Bagdasarian homestead received California Historical Landmark designation in 2018, with the original underground oven preserved at Fresno County Historical Museum. Family descendants maintain the bakery through 5 generations as of 2024, using traditional methods that great-great-grandfather Hagop had carried from Armenian mountains to California valleys. The annual Armenian Heritage Baking Festival attracted 3,000 visitors, celebrating techniques that had saved hundreds of lives and transformed regional food systems through one immigrant's refusal to abandon knowledge that frontier experts called stupid. Modern thermal engineering confirmed, through scientific measurement, what 1893 empirical results had demonstrated through survival necessity. The underground clay oven hadn't just baked better bread. It proved that dismissing immigrant traditional knowledge as backward often revealed not their ignorance, but American inability to recognize sophisticated engineering developed through centuries of resource scarcity. Bagdasarian's hole in the ground, anticipated by 130 years. The energy-efficient methods contemporary sustainability advocates promoted. Ultimate validation that cultural humility created more resilient communities than nationalist assumptions about technological superiority ever could.